All right, can you see and hear me okay, guys? Thank you, George. I noted your comment in there. You could see me for just a second. Yeah, I was just jumping around. Well, let me know if you can see and hear. And we'll get started. Hello, Dave. George, of course. Jonathan, welcome. All righty. I'm sure we'll get a few more that are going to trickle in here. Just kind of getting the tech stuff taken care of, making sure we're good. Haven't seen Doug from Diamond Digital Media come in yet, but I'm sure he'll be here to support us. Let's hope that the microphone holds out. We're using the Yeti from Blue, and normally works really great, but we had some issues last Thursday, as you may recall, getting a lot of static. We hope that it will continue to be robust tonight. If we have any issues, please let me know in the chat room, and I will try to pay attention. Kathleen will be... Thank you, Jonathan. Good. All right. Thank you, George. Kathleen is going to be monitoring chat room for me, and she'll let me know if we have any tech issues as well. So, we have a lot to cover. I apologize that we couldn't make it on Sunday. Just... if you saw my weather report that I posted in Patreon, just ridiculously hot. I have the air conditioner going. Let me know if the air conditioner in the background is too noisy, and I'll turn it on and off periodically. George, sometimes I do think that humidity produces some static, so that may very well have been an issue. The humidity has been unseasonably high and dense this week, but finally, last evening, everything kind of broke. We're back to, the mid 80s, and the humidity's down to a manageable level, and I think we're good for the week. So today and tomorrow, we will persevere and come back, Lord willing, on Sunday. I think the weather's going to be okay until probably Monday, when it looks like we may warm up a little bit. So, with the weather report out of the way, let us get right into it, because, I always have so much to share with you guys, and it just gets backlogged if I miss a live stream. And it really, quite honestly, it aggravates me when I miss a live stream, because I really want to keep pace. I want to keep things moving forward for your benefit, and really keep you up to date on what I've discovered for you. But I'm going to backtrack in a few moments back into Kabbalah. I sent you, just as we were about to go to live stream, and this always seems to happen, I do my last minute email checks just to make sure I don't have any patrons that are having issues getting on board with the live stream. So I always check my emails, and then invariably I run across something that pops in that I just can't walk away from. So I sent to you a link to an article. This is from Futurism, and it is entitled "Mind-Bending Quantum Darwinism Theory Passes Experimental Tests. All these studies see what is expected, at least approximately." So we're going to touch on that at the beginning before we get into the body of the material that I really wanted to present tonight. I just can't tear myself away from both quantum physics and the Kabbalah too much. What I had and will want to launch into, it sounds like it's disconnected, but I know that I've had several patrons last week leading up to the 50th anniversary of the alleged moon landing, and I wanted to revisit that in more detail, because I kind of just gave you the first blush overview of it. I intended on Sunday to get into this a little more, and so I want to do that today. I want to give you really what I find an extraordinary book, and let me put that up on the screen here for you. Okay, make sure that this music isn't playing. Okay, that's off. Okay. This book is from Gerhard Wisniewski, and it is entitled One Small Step. You can find this on Amazon. One Small Step, ? The Great Moon Hoax and the Race to Dominate Earth from Space. Now, this is a very rational, non-conspiracy theory. In fact, he even, addresses and defines what is a conspiracy theorist, but that isn't the point of the book so much as he breaks down the scientific analysis on how, from a science-based observation of the evidence, there's no way man has ever been to the moon. Okay? I prefaced all that with the major category of radiation, the Van Allen radiation belts, of which there are two. I'm going to get into that a little more. I'm going to quote from his book. It's an outstanding, rational discussion of the topic. So, Joshua 23:10, I think, is, I'm stretching a point here. I'm playing a little bit, but Joshua 23:10 from the Bible, one of you can put 1,000 to flight, because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. So I'm kind of stretching it. I'm kind of applying it just because of the word flight. But again, we preface everything with Scripture because God is in control. He's the Creator. Jesus Christ died for our sins. We acknowledge him as our Lord and Savior, that he died and resurrected. He shed his blood for us. We've been justified by his blood. And on the third day, he rose. The gospel, plain and simple. And so in light of that, I try to relate Scripture to the topic of discussion because all truth is found in the Bible. We can relate any topic to the Word and vice versa. So maybe I'm stretching a point saying 1,000 to flight, but it underscores the whole point of this, of what I'm saying, is that we have no fear. We have no fear in discussing the evidence of evil. We have no fear in discussing theories and conjecture. You have no problem discussing things like Kabbalah. Okay? Not because we are trying to become practitioners of dark arts. Quite the opposite. We're exposing the dark arts here. And therefore, you have to have that full armor. You have to be prayed up. You have to be, if you will, in good standing with the Lord in order to examine the things that we all examine here. Okay? Alrighty. So, yeah, One Small Step, ? by Gerhard Wisniewski on Amazon. George puts on there. Thank you very much. Wisnewski is the last name. Thank you, George. We don't have any fear in examining the evidence, and we also, as a quote from Star Trek, to go boldly where no man has gone before. They changed that many years ago to be politically correct, to say no one or no person or man or woman, whatever it is, they changed that silly tagline to. Anyway, the other part of what I want to discuss, that we're going to kind of go back in time here, because I like to reference history so that you know who the modern players are. So connecting here with this discussion of whether we landed a man on the moon or not is to discuss Laurel Canyon in Southern California and the Vietnam War. And many of you, having already read that, you know exactly where I'm going with this. You know all about Laurel Canyon. So we'll touch on it. We're not going to go deep into it. But we're going to connect Laurel Canyon, the Vietnam War, and the moon landing by looking at society, looking at the culture of the 60s and the 70s at that time, in a snapshot. We only have a couple of hours this evening, okay? Now, final programming note, tomorrow on the Thursday live stream, I want to segue over into discussing the book Propaganda, authored by Edward Bernays, who's considered the father of modern propaganda. It's existed for thousands of years, but modern propaganda, especially with its influence on modern American culture and societal changes. So I want to get into that tomorrow, because we'll talk a little bit about Edward today at the end of the live stream to make that connection to tomorrow. But bear in mind, those of you that are familiar with Edward Bernays, bear in mind his work as we go into talking about the moon landing hoax, why it was a hoax. And I'm going to propose to you a reason that perhaps has not been publicly considered before. Not that it's a dark secret, just a conclusion, okay, as to why it was even hoaxed. And then we'll get into weaving in Laurel Canyon and the music and the hippie scene of the 60s and 70s, and why that was going on at the same time as the Vietnam War. And here's a hint. Here's a connector between Laurel Canyon and the Vietnam War. CIA. Okay? Nothing conspiratorial here. Going to share with you research. Okay? All right. So before we get into that, we're going to do a little Kabbalah. We're going to do a little bit of quantum Darwinism. This article. Let me go ahead and put myself back on camera. And we'll skip through this article very quickly. The reason I'm sharing it with you, I'm going to go right to at the beginning, and then I'm going to backtrack, as we always do. One of the stranger aspects of the quantum world is superposition, the ability of a quantum system to exist in more than one state at a time. The system seemingly only snaps into one state or the other, moving from the quantum world to the classical, the moment we observe it, okay? So again, the system seemingly only snaps into one state or another. That's the collapsing of the waveform, moving from one quantum world to the classical. That means from the quantum waveform world to the physical classical world we interact with at the macroscopic scale, the atomic molecular macro scale. But it's this collapsing of the waveform that's described in quantum physics due to our observation of the waveform. Remember, we've talked about the double slit experiment. Now, the article says that process is called decoherence. The quantum Darwinism is an attempt to explain it. So let's look at that. Rather than our observation being the thing that forces the quantum system into one state or another, quantum Darwinism suggests that it is the system's interactions, underscore that word, interactions, with the environment causing decoherence. Now I'm going to stop right there, because this is reflective evidence of a statement straight out of the Kabbalah. This whole notion of interacting with the environment. What this means in Kabbalistic terms is that man existed prior to the fall in a pure form. It was only when man interacted with the environment that he then fell to this lower state. Does that not sound like quantum mechanics saying the double slit experiment, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Niels Bohr explaining how all that works? It doesn't matter who the scientist is or the terminology. What undergirds quantum mechanics, particle physics today, is a product of the infiltration, indoctrination, and manipulation of the Talmudic rabbi Kabbalists into the world of science. And so it doesn't surprise me when I read an article like this that says that the system's interactions with the environment cause decoherence. A scientific term, decoherence. In physics, it is a state of chaos, a state of interruption, a state of breaking things down. There are many applications of decoherence, including in computer science. Decoherence is the introduction of errors into a computational process. So if you think in terms of errors in a software system and in computer hardware, even in computer science, that notion itself of errors is reflective of the Kabbalistic notion that man is in a fallen state. He's in error. Hence, this leads in the Kabbalah, and it leads to, in the world of quantum mechanics, it leads to this notion of tikkun, the redemption, the rebuilding, the reconstructing. Let me get one of my reference books here in front of me, because we just have a wealth of information in these books that we've been referencing to you, and I want to just go to this real quick. The word tikkun means rectification or mending. In the Kabbalah, tikkun, that's T-I-K-K-U-N, tikkun refers to a process of elevation and transformation, whereas the second definition implies taking something that is already complete into a more refined state. The first definition implies that something has broken or become torn, and the immediate goal is only to return it to its original state of completion. There are two processes or modes of tikkun. So in short, look at what's going on in science today. I want to get myself back on camera here so you can see myself yapping at you. Look at what science is doing. Look at, for example, DNA. They say that we have corrupted DNA, that there are errors in the DNA, that man needs to redefine his genetic code. Okay, that's Kabbalah. Look at artificial intelligence. They're saying that AI can do everything better than a human can. That's their goal. Okay, well, that's tikkun of the mind, of the brain. Look at what we talked about on Thursday, and Wednesday and Thursday we talked about Elon Musk, and we were looking at the neural link. Okay, this is you take the words of Elon Musk, and he says that the greatest existential threat to the human race is artificial intelligence. He said that 5 years ago, and he's still saying that. And that the only solution is that we connect ourselves to AI, connect our brains to AI. That's tikkun. Okay? Many of these people make these statements, like Elon Musk, Geordie Rose, and many others that we've discussed here, and I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't even realize that they're Kabbalists. If you were to ask one of them, are you a practicing Kabbalist? They would say, no, probably. Okay? But that's reflective of infiltration, indoctrination, manipulation. With the founding fathers, as I call it, of quantum physics in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the turn of the century into the 1900s, okay? Those that have been manipulated by all of this don't realize the source of it. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're sharing with you. The source of our today's scientific disciplines is all hearkening back to Kabbalah. And we see it in what they're producing. Okay? Let me give you a couple more examples and we'll move away from this and get right to the moon. All right, I'm over on my webcam microphone. Can you hear me any better? I've turned off the Yeti. How does that sound, guys? Okay, if you'll turn off the air conditioner. Okay, I'll turn off the air conditioner. The air conditioner is right behind the camera, and I know that that's way too noisy, too interfering. So we're okay now, guys? All good? Okay, good. All right, well, we can see that somebody's interfering with us again because we're talking about things they don't want us to talk about. Okay, so last point on science and Kabbalah. The magic of Kabbalah, and it's literally the word magic, okay? Again, I'm reading from our reference books. The magic of Kabbalah has been described as matter manipulation, the ability to recast the course of events in the physical realm through sorcery. Jesus referred to this as false prophets showing great signs and wonders. So, quoting from Revelation 18:23, it says, "For by thy sorceries were all nations deceived." Okay? So, this is what's going on, folks. Kabbalah, as Kathleen and I are declaring, and have for many weeks now, is the one world religion. Its operating system is quantum mechanics. And the software system of the operating system of quantum mechanics at its heart is geomancy as the software, the binary system originating through divinatory process of geomancy. Okay, so that's just for people who've never been with us before and haven't heard any of this before. Yeah.
They wanted you to go back. They missed about 5 minutes of what you were saying. They lost the last 5 or 6 minutes. So Jonathan's saying go back to the wave.
Okay, so I'll summarize it real quickly. If we have a waveform, and we're talking double slit experiment, but imagine an energy wave, and it's just doing its thing in the cosmos. Nobody's detecting it, nobody's interfering, nobody's measuring, nobody's observing it. The Kabbalist will say that is a spirit energy wave, which it may or may not be. That's okay. We as Christians believe that spirits are energy. But the physical reality down below, because in Kabbalah they view the cosmos of spiritual energy above, physical fallen state, collapsed state, broken state, decoherent state is below. So this quantum, I was citing from the article, this quantum Darwinism is indicating that it is because of the interaction of a system with its environment that causes decoherence. Decoherence, in Kabbalist terms, is man's fallen state, the physical below. So the energy waveform, the spiritual waveform, when we observe it as a human, science will say, and the Kabbalists will say, that it's our observation of that spirit that causes it to collapse in its state of perfection, where it exists without interference with the environment. But once interference with the environment is encountered, that spiritual state collapses to a physical state, which they consider below, consider it the fallen state. Decoherence is a scientific term, but the Kabbalist describes decoherence as a spiritual existence not engaging with the environment, but once it does engage with the environment, it then becomes physical reality. Scientific explanation is once we as humans observe, we measure, we detect a waveform, it causes that waveform to collapse to a physical form. Scientists don't realize that they are using different words to describe the same process, a process first defined by the Talmudic Kabbalists when they infiltrated the world of science in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Infiltrated, then indoctrinated, and now for 4 generations of scientists have manipulated the scientific mindset to coincide with the Kabbalist mindset of the cosmos and how it operates and the state of man, and that the tree of life that we were, or the tree of knowledge that we were forbidden in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were forbidden from partaking of the tree of knowledge that you would then know good and evil, okay, is the Sephiroth tree, the 10 Sephiroths, the tree of life of the Kabbalists, is that tree of knowledge. And so it is specifically forbidden in Scripture that we should partake in the tree of knowledge. this 10 Sephiroth tree, with its attendant Kundalini serpent spirit that goes up through the trunk of the tree, through the spine of a human, to the mind, to the crown, to the Keter of the Sephiroth tree. We're not supposed to be involved in Kabbalah. And yet modern science today, with the one world religion of Kabbalah, the operating system of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and its attendant software of geomancy, that's a system we are not supposed to be partaking in. We're not supposed to be building it out. It is the beast system. Now, we use it to communicate as we are now. We use it with our phones and our computers. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need to understand its source and what its purpose is. And it is this notion of, from the Kabbalist, of tikkun that we see reflected in modern scientific DNA manipulation, the human genome, the artificial intelligence, why all of this is being promoted, why transhumanism, why neural lace, neural link, as Elon Musk is now calling it, this connecting. And I'm devoting not all of, but the majority of the August issue of Entangled magazine to the discussion of transhumanism and the neural link, the linking, the connecting of the human mind to computers. And the first human trials for FDA approval, Elon Musk projects, it's going to happen next year. So, we're going to discuss that in Entangled magazine. Now, this live stream is going out publicly on Friday on Blog Talk Radio, because our Sunday live stream typically is broadcast on Friday on Blog Talk Radio, but we didn't do a Sunday broadcast, so tonight's live stream will be. The chat room obviously is not captured in an audio-only broadcast, but this broadcast will be live to the public following its conclusion on YouTube, and the chat room will not be live at that time either. So anyway, kind of got off track a little bit there, but that hopefully got us caught up to where we are reviewing what I presented before we were cut off by that static. Again, Blog Talk Radio, folks, Entangled magazine is available monthly. It's been published now in August. It'll be the 19th issue, and it's $30 a year. You got all of the back issues as well. If you join the group that I'm speaking with this evening, which are the patrons, our friends, you, for $20 a month or more, you will get a full year subscription to Entangled magazine, but you also have access to 18 months of live streams. And we've produced 3 live streams per week, 2 hours each live stream for 18 months, Kathleen and myself. And that's a huge body of information to accompany Entangled magazine. And we have webinars in there as well, and articles, and I post almost every day. I send out articles of interest to the patrons. So those of you on Blog Talk Radio, we encourage you to join. If you don't want the magazine, you can join for a lesser amount. Okay, so that's my little plug for Patreon. So we'll move along. Is there a question, Kathleen, before I launch into our next topic du jour, which is the moon?
No.
Okay, alrighty. Okay, guys. At the top of the hour, we're going to take our 5-minute break. We'll play some music, and I'll get to turn my air conditioner back on. Oh, it's just terrible.
It's not too bad tonight.
No, it's not bad tonight, but I will need to turn it back on at the break. All right, one small step, question mark. Let me start right there. Gerhard Wisniewski is the author of One Small Step, question mark, The Great Moon Hoax and the Race to Dominate Earth from Space. I'm going to take some excerpts from there this evening. Just a phenomenal body of work, but let me just take from Amazon their synopsis. Is it possible that the famous American moon landings were nothing but an illusion, all a fabrication? Could NASA have fooled the world by broadcasting simulations that had been filmed for training purposes? Okay, And that's the heart of a lot of the photographic evidence is film footage and still shots taken during training sessions, okay? And I'll explain a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so he's got over 200 photographs and diagrams and whatnot available. Here we go. There was a program at NASA that was called Corona. This was a cover story that led to the moon landing. So I'm going to give you a couple of touch points if you're making notes. Look up Project Corona, like the Corona beer or the Corona of the sun. C-O-R-O-N-A. C-O-R-O-N-A, Corona. Yeah, it just amazes me. I open all these things up, these tabs. Someone comes along into my system and closes my tabs. Let's look at a timeline here. This will kind of set the stage for us. Many of you in the audience are not as old as myself and don't really remember the 60s. You may not have even been born in the 60s, and if you were, you probably were very, very young. I was born in 1953. Do the math. So we're looking at 1969 and going forward. We're going to do a side-by-side between the moon and Vietnam, and then we're going to go to Laurel Canyon. It's a strange journey, my friends. Now that should ring a bell for some people that know about music from the 60s. Okay, May 1969. I'm going to do a side-by-side straight out of the book. The media reveal illegal bombardments in Cambodia. Now on the other side, side-by-side, we're talking about the moon. Media hype on Apollo 10, the final test mission before the moon landing. Now in June of '69, Nixon announces withdrawal of U.S. troops, but in fact only 25,000 instead of 540,000 depart. A transparently thin ruse that will buy the president a little time. Now, with the Apollo program, the nation is watching the debriefing of Apollo 10 and all agog as to the first landing on the moon. So what I'm doing is I'm showing you the societal mindset going on in 1969. At that time, I was a sophomore in high school. I won't tell you how young my wife was at the time because I might get in trouble, okay? Not by her. Anyway. So I was in high school when this stuff was going on. So it's very schizophrenic. We as the public were concerned about Vietnam. There are protests in the streets. I was a few miles from UC Berkeley where I was growing up. Was at Berkeley many times during the riots. So it's in our face. And yet on the other side of the schizophrenic example here, I'm paying attention to the Apollo space program because my science teachers are talking about it. The astronauts are all heroes, you know, that are participating in all of this. I remember building plastic models of the Gemini spacecraft, okay? I mean, here, you know, we're worried about Vietnam, and at the same time we're applauding America, this shining example to the world that we're trying to get to the moon. So why the moon program? I think you may have already made the leap, but I'll continue painting this tapestry for you. July 1969, on 14 July, a torture scandal comes to light that is like a foretaste of Abu Ghraib, I can't pronounce it, but you know what I'm talking about, in 2004, the abuse of prisoners. This concerns the training of a certain Francis Rittemeyer, who had been trained for killing and torturing in Vietnam. On the flip side, just in time to save the day, Apollo 11 blasts off on July 16th, and the nation enthralled. 4 days later, the Eagle makes its historic, immaculate landing on the pristine surface of the moon. Vietnam is forgotten for a while as America swells with patriotic pride for having beaten the evil empire, the Soviet Union at the time, to the moon. November 1969. The honeymoon is short-lived, however, for in November of 1969, Seymour Hersh publishes a story about the Phoenix program's massacre of 504 civilians in the village of My Lai, bringing home to America the full savagery of the War of Southeast Asia. On 14 November, Apollo 12 was launched for another picture book landing on the moon. While U.S. soldiers are murdering, torturing, and pillaging in Vietnam, America is completely carried away by its clean-cut space heroes. Now, let me underscore, that was the words of the author, not my words. I know that most of our soldiers were not committing murder and they weren't torturing and pillaging in Vietnam, okay? There's always just a small handful of idiots, and I can say that as a veteran, idiots that engage in that practice. Okay, March, April 1970, the U.S. topple Cambodia's Prince Sihanouk and install a puppet government. So I'll skip down through all this stuff. Meanwhile, on 11 April, it's time for yet another moon launch, and I'll skip down through that. January 71, the U.S. a certain U.S. Colonel, William Calley, is accused of war crimes. Okay, blah, 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 that's my lay. Apollo 14 is launched on 31 January, this being the first launch since the catastrophic accident of Apollo 13. All right, once again, it commands the undivided attention of the public. There's your next hint of the tapestry, folks. Undivided attention of the public. July 1971, New York Times returns to publishing the scandalous Pentagon Papers. Apollo 15 is launched on 26 July after yet another flawless mission that clearly demonstrates that America is the coolest nation on the earth, the words of the author. Okay, 1972, Vietnam launch of massive offensive. Nixon retaliates with bombing, bombardments. This doesn't say here, but that's the Tet Offensive, 1972. Remember that very well. The opposite side, they also responded by launching on April 16th another rocket to the moon, Apollo 16. December 72, peace seemingly almost within reach, negotiations are broken off under cover of Apollo 17 and replaced by another massive bombardment, cost thousands of human lives. Apollo 17 is launched on 7 November, triumphant return to the Earth on 19 December. Okay, just 5 weeks after 19 December 1972, the talks have resumed. A peace agreement is announced. A few days later, a ceasefire comes into effect, thereby officially ending America's involvement in Southeast Asia. Now, when did the Apollo program end, my friends? Peace came to Vietnam in December of 1972. Apollo 17 is launched on 7 December and returns on 19 December. 19 December, same time Apollo 17 returned, peace is officially announced in Vietnam on the same day, 19 December. That was the end of the Apollo program. Ostensibly the last time we went to the moon and back with a manned spacecraft. Okay? So here's the tapestry, and I'm going to come back to this book in just a moment. I think you see the picture. Was it a space race involving us and the Soviets? No. At the same time we were sending the Apollo, supposedly, spacecraft to the moon, the first time to the moon, and I'll look this up in the book to find you the exact wording. The same day that we ostensibly landed for the first time on the moon, the Soviets placed a lander, an unmanned lander on the moon, and retrieved space rocks. Moon rocks. Okay? Where do you think the moon rocks came from? Came from the Soviets. Why? Because the Soviet Union in the 70s was having huge weather problems, devastating their wheat crops. And the United States provided wheat to the Soviets in return for moon rocks and to keep their mouths shut about us never going to the moon. So if it's not the Soviets, why did we put up this whole Apollo program? Because the country was unraveling. From 1960 on, the 60s almost meant the end of the United States. We needed a psychological boost. The country needed something they could rally behind that was positive. You had the civil rights riots, Martin Luther King being assassinated, Kennedy being assassinated. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had the Bay of Pigs incident before the missile crisis. Malcolm X was assassinated. We had riots in the streets. We had huge, racial tensions in the country and outright rioting in many cities. The country was under tremendous duress. And I offer this to you. Our going to the moon had nothing to do with beating the Russians. It had everything to do with raising the morale of the U.S. population into believing that we were the white knights, that we really were not bad people, that the American dream was still alive, that suburbia was building out from the 50s into the 60s, and that American dream of having your own home and raising your kids and sending them to school and bettering their lives beyond your own in peace. I remember in high school, my parents were very concerned that I was going to get drafted. I was number 11 on the draft, on the lottery. It was a draft lottery. I got my notice to report to the induction center in 30 days because I was number 11 on the list. A week before I was due to report, they canceled the draft because the war came to an end. Now, years later, I enlisted on my own. As you know, I was a veteran. So,
David said that he believed the Tet Offensive in Vietnam was in 68, not 72.
Yeah, the investigation was in 72 that concluded, yeah, it was 68. Or I should say, I was thinking Miley investigation. He's right, Tet Offensive 68. So there was a massive incursion from Laos that we were bombing at that time, of the North Vietnamese, Russian troops really coming in. So let me get back to this book a little bit here. So I've kind of set the stage for you of what was going on at the time, back and forth. Again, I encourage you to get this book and read it. It really is a very well done snapshot of what was occurring and what the rationale for the hoax, because we needed a win. The United States, the public needed a win. One, it was a distraction away from the Vietnam War, and the other was to try to make us appear to be the world's great power. Okay? Now, a lot of the photographs in this book also will show really scientific evidence that this was a hoax. And what I'd offer to you is a very great breakdown scientifically of the photographic camera that was used on the moon. There was one in the lander and one in the command module and one in the orbiter. Okay? So these are not lightweight cameras. These are Hasselblad. That's Hasselblad. Hasselblad 500 ELs. So these are fairly large, heavy cameras. The author breaks down focal lengths the size and type of lens that was used. And here's the thing that is really something that's easy to grasp and understand. The camera was not shielded against the temperature extremes on the moon, which ranged from 100 degrees centigrade plus on the heat side to under 100 degrees centigrade on the negative, on the minus side, nor did it have any shielding against radioactive energies, radioactive rays. So how does it take perfect pictures? Now, he goes on at length to describe what I will summarize for you here. Picture that you have an astronaut, and I'll get myself back on camera here. The camera is mounted to the chest of the spacesuit. The astronaut cannot view through the viewfinder the image. There are no automatic adjusters for focus, focal length, aperture speed, f-stops, none of that. All of that has to be done manually. So you have in the book all of these photographic images that are perfect. They're framed perfectly, they're lighted perfectly, they're all in focus. Even though it's a brightly lit lunar surface directly from the sun, you have multiple directions of sources of light, not a single source, which is what the sun would be providing. And this lunar surface is so highly reflective that he goes into detail talking about the Kodachrome film that was used. That particular film was so sensitive to light that it should have just overexposed all of the film every time they clicked a shutter. And yet nothing is over or underexposed. There's a thing in photography called bracketing. So you would go over and then what you think is the correct exposure and underexposed. Hopefully out of those three you'll get one if you're not sure about your lighting. Well, they didn't bracket any of their images. Every one from the first to the last was perfect. And the thing that's also interesting is that he shows this again in photographs in the book. Images of an astronaut exiting the lander, coming down the ladder. And yet, the astronaut who's in a shadow, because the sun is supposedly on the other side of the lander, which means that on the opposite side from the sun would be complete blackout conditions. It's well lit. It's not grainy, not out of focus. Depth of field is perfect. And so there's a series of photographs that are all perfect. And this is repeated over and over, where something that should in shadow not be visible is visible in shadow. And there are multiple sources of light, and they didn't bring any lighting equipment with them. It was only the sun. And there are many images where you see a bright white hot spot of light that's on the black background that should just be the black background of space, when it's evident that it's a false black backdrop in a studio, in a hangar. Now here's something, getting away from the photography for a moment. You've all seen the science fiction movies where the spacecraft is coming down, its rocket engines are blasting out, fire and flame, and it comes close to the surface and all the debris starts getting kicked up and it carves out, a little hole in the ground. All the science fiction movies show that. In fact, Wernher von Braun, in his own book, described what it would look like once we first landed on the moon. And he described the crater that would result from the lander's descent under rocket engine power. And yet there's no crater. In fact, there are close-up photographs by NASA of the pads of the lander that are wrapped in foil, and there's not a speck of dust, there's nothing out of place, there's no disturbance of the soil, and there's no debris on the lander's pad itself. And yet there are transcripts during the descent in which the astronauts are saying that the dust is getting kicked up. And yet there's no dust on the spacecraft itself. No disturbance of the sand and soil and rocks. In fact, the consistency of the material was identical to that in the training hangar, from which they did produce photographs of training missions. So how did they have the same material in the hangar that they would find on the moon when they first landed? When you go back and look at photographs and you see light coming from 90 degrees from the side, you should see parallel shadows. Shadows that have the straight line configuration. Again, you're looking at it from the side, and straight lines of shadows coming perpendicular, but the lines in parallel in front of you. Well, the NASA photos show non-parallel shadows from a 90-degree perpendicular position of observation by the camera of these shadows. What this is an indication of is multiple sources of light from different positions, casting individual shadows. When on the moon, it's supposed to be one source of light, that being the sun, from one direction. Now, let's talk about radiation, which is where I left off. Yeah, go ahead.
Tamara had a question.
Sure.
She was asking what you made of Apollo 13.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and also, wasn't there a movie, was it with Tom Hanks?
Tom Hanks was Apollo 13.
I thought so. And anytime they go into, Hollywood goes into making extensive...
It's a propaganda film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to be suspect of that. But
Well, it's a good thing that Tamara asked about Apollo 13 because we're going to talk about radiation.
okay.
And that is absolutely germane to that. And again, it's from the book. So I'll just paraphrase from the book for you rather than reading. You know the source material that I'm paraphrasing from. Here's the deal. After I say this, I'll go and get you a couple of numbers out of the book because I want to read some of the thicknesses of the spacecraft. Okay? What I said in the last two statements about the moon hoax relative to radiation is this. You would have to have large amounts of lead shielding in order to protect the astronauts from their traversing through both Van Allen radiation belts. Beyond the radiation belts, beyond 100 miles from Earth, you now have the radiation and the micrometeorites coming in from the cosmos, from all directions. That requires shielding, which is very heavy and was not part of the spacecraft. So in Apollo 13, one of the things that is an anomaly about the moon landings is the liftoff from the moon. When the explosive bolts sever the bolts holding the landing module and the return module to get back to the orbiting command module. When they needed to separate, they did so by detonating explosive bolts that held the two spacecraft together, leaving the landing portion on the surface. Also, to cut the cables and wire connections between the two craft, they had guillotines. They had blades that would come down vertically and chop through cables and wires. Now, all of that causes a certain amount of sound, noise. Now, add to that the liftoff engine, which was housed within the same compartment, a pressurized compartment, that the astronauts were occupying, the two astronauts. They were standing 60 centimeters from the engine itself, inside a shared pressurized compartment, shared by the engine and the astronauts. And this is bizarre. You're standing right next to, this far, from a roaring engine blasting you off the lunar surface. And yet in the radio transmissions, there's just a little bit of static heard. No explosive bolts, no roar of the engine 60 centimeters from your mouthpiece. And those that are proponents that we went to the moon say, well, that's because there's no atmosphere. It's a vacuum. Well, that's true outside the spacecraft, but inside the spacecraft, you have a pressurized, breathable atmosphere, and just the metal of the spacecraft itself would conduct sound, energy waves, through the metal to the inside atmosphere. Now let's go to Apollo 13. When Apollo 13 supposedly was out there and doing its thing and had this explosion that took place and blew out large panels on the side of the spacecraft, that was heard loud and clear. But they didn't go to the moon and land. How far out were they? Well, they were occupying the command module, Apollo 13, at the time of the detonation. And like the little lander, the LEM, and the return module to the orbiting command module, there wasn't any shielding from radiation. So how did they survive? Apollo 13 and all of the Apollo missions survived transiting both Van Allen radiation belts. They survived it because they never transited through them. So give me a moment. Let me scroll down through the book and I'll find you these numbers. I want to cite the numbers that he produces on the spacecraft. Great book. I mean, really, really, really just well documented. And he talks about moon rocks. He talks about the cameras, the construction of the craft, the radio transmissions, what's going on in the world at the time, and the fact that the Russians were cooperative with us and brought moon rocks back using their unmanned craft in exchange for wheat. I mean, that sounds bizarre, but that's the truth. I mean, that's the state of the nations at the time, state of the world. Oh, here's a funny one. One of the Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke, before he goes to the moon, he has a family portrait taken by a NASA photographer, and then he has it laminated in plastic, and he ostensibly took it to the moon and placed it on the surface of the moon. Well, think about what happens when a photograph set in your windowsill is exposed to direct sunlight. It fades. What happens if you put it in an oven, 100-degree centigrade oven with plastic lamination? It's going to incinerate. And yet NASA has a picture of it supposedly sitting on the moon, where it would never survive. Just think about, you have something that's laminated and it's in a atmospheric condition. Okay? And then you take it from a pressurized atmospheric condition inside this laminated photograph. It has an atmosphere. And then you put it in a vacuum. It's going to expand and rupture the lamination. And yet there it is laying on the moon according to NASA photo AS16 117 18841. Sure. Okay? I mean, it's just, people ask me, what's the evidence? And I gave, just a cursory example when I explained it. But what I'm getting at here is the real nub of the issue. Along with everything else that's in this book, I think the radiation is very compelling, that argument. I think I can find this. One of my failings is I'm a speed reader. And I read through things very quickly, but I don't always know exactly where a specific item was in the book. So I'm getting to it. I see it here. Okay. So, back when Sputnik was launched into orbit, we sent Explorer 1, supposedly. Well, we did. Explorer 2. So what they did was they sent up Geiger counters into space to measure radiation. And they sent it on an elliptical orbit. Its closest point to the Earth would be 360 kilometers. Its most distant point from the Earth was 2,500 kilometers. This was Dr. Van Allen, for which the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts is named after. They were doing work that resembled the work of radiation protection personnel gingerly approaching a leaky nuclear power station, or consumer protection personnel taking a Geiger counter to the vegetable market after the accident at Chernobyl. In both cases, those involved would have turned tail and fled if their Geiger counter had immediately given up the ghost completely. And this is what did happen with the Geiger counter on Explorer 1 soon after it arrived from space. As expected, the readings increased the further away from the Earth the rocket traveled, but then suddenly ceased altogether. What could have happened? It was unlikely that there was no more radiation for the counter to measure. Perhaps radio communication had simply broken down. To clarify this, Explorer 2 was launched the 5th of March 1958, but it never reached orbit because one of its thrust stages failed, so all hopes were pinned on Explorer 3, which was launched 26 May 1958. This time the flight was successful, but the instruments delivered the same results as those shown the first time. Radiation rose steadily with increasing distance from the Earth and then suddenly went down to zero. And as the satellite got closer to Earth again, the reverse happened. Radioactivity rose from zero to maximum and then gradually declined as distance from the Earth reduced. There could only be one explanation for this. Beyond a certain distance from the Earth, radioactivity was so strong that the Geiger counter was simply overloaded and gave no more readings. When the scientists realized this, one of them, Ernie Ray, couldn't help exclaiming, "My God, space is radioactive." This was indeed bad news. The researchers were dismayed. So, blah, 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 blah. Further probes then showed that there was also a second radiation belt. These are regions where solar and cosmic radioactivity meets the Earth's magnetic field. The effect is like that of a snowplow pushing its way through deep snow, where the largest amounts of snow accumulate in front of the plow itself. The Earth does indeed rush through space like a kind of radiation plow, and especially large quantities of radioactive particles collect in its random belts, named Van Allen radiation belts after their discoverer. The assault of solar radioactivity causes the radiation belts and magnetic field to be dammed up on the side of the face of the Earth facing the Sun and is attenuated on the side facing away from the Sun. The fact that the Geiger counters on Explorers 1 and 3 had temporarily shut down was worrying enough, but for the moment the extent to which the amount of radiation had overstepped the capacity of the measuring instruments remained open. Then the answer came by a factor of 1,000, says America's Space Science Institute. Now, they get into a whole bunch of things in terms of measurements of radiation. I won't go into all of that. I think I've made the point. I want to get to the shielding on board the craft itself. This is fascinating. In this sense, the Apollo missions were not only sensational on account of the moon landings, but also because they were the first manned missions supposedly to pass through and leave behind the Earth's protective radioactive belts. Neither before nor after this have manned spacecraft departed from orbit round the Earth and flown through the Van Allen belts. Okay? Nobody has penetrated the Van Allen radiation belts in terms of a human. This was a spectacular step of which, strange to say, not much notice was taken. Surely it would have been well worth mentioning that on 21 December 1968, manned capsules had made the experiment of departing from the planet's protective envelope and passing through the dangerous radioactive belts. That was the day on which Apollo 8 left its orbit round the Earth and passed through the Van Allen belts on its way to the moon. This alone was not only a considerable risk to take, but also a spectacular scientific experiment on human beings. Actually, one of the main concerns should have been to ask what radioactivity was being measured, how the astronauts were feeling, and whether the flight ought to be immediately aborted. There were also other clearly defined moments during the approach to the moon and after landing on it when it would have been necessary to make decisions regarding aborting the mission. Remarkably, there were no such considerations when human beings passed through the Earth's radiation belts and flew out into empty space. The Apollo 8 press kit devoted one meager paragraph to this historic aspect of the event, despite the fact that until then no manned Apollo capsule had ever crossed the Van Allen belts. The claim stated in the kit that what was inside the Apollo capsule with its thick walls, the astronauts were in no danger. Let me read that again. Despite the fact that until then, no manned Apollo capsule had ever crossed the Van Allen belts. The claim stated in the kit, that's in the press kit, was, and this is the claim, that inside the Apollo capsule, with its thick walls, the astronauts were in no danger from solar radiation and the Van Allen radiation belts. Now, this is the author. As far as I know, no unmanned Apollo capsule equipped to measure radioactivity or carrying animals had been sent up to pass through the radiation belts in order to test its shielding capacity. NASA claimed that the estimated radiation dose would be below 1 rad per man, which was lower than a thorough chest X-ray. During Apollo 8's supposed passage through the Van Allen belt, nothing remained of the agitation present at the time of Explorer 1. Remember, their Geiger counter went crazy. Yet the shielding capacity of the Apollo capsule was only 7.5 thousandths of the shielding provided by the Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field at the equator. So our natural shields around the Earth, Apollo capsule only had 7.5 thousandths of that shielding available to them. This means that, comparatively speaking, the Apollo astronauts were flying naked through the Van Allen belts. Shielding equal to that on the Earth would have required a wall of water 10 meters thick or one of lead 90 centimeters thick. Yet the Apollo capsule's shielding amounted to a wall of lead only 7 millimeters thick. That's what I said when I was first posed the question, and I said, look, in order to have enough lead to be able to protect them from the radiation of these two belts, it would be so heavy that it would be too costly and nearly impossible, given the Saturn V rocket technology of the day, impossible to lift enough lead, because you get into this cat chasing its tail, that if you increase the payload, then you have to add more rocket engines. If you add more rocket engines, you have to have more fuel. If you add more fuel, then you got to have more rocket engines because of the more fuel, and you end up chasing your tail. See, there's a threshold there of maximum payload of the technology of the day, which was the Saturn V rocket. So we're overdue for our 5-minute break. We'll stop there and we'll talk a little bit more about radiation when we come back. So I'm going to go ahead and put the music on, give you guys a break.
Jonathan had a couple of questions when you come back.
Okay, we'll take questions when we come back.
And George wants to know about the magazines, if you're doing anything to get them in color. I'd like you to address that. And Jonathan,
okay, well,
saying,
let me get this started, and then you can tell me. All right, we're going to get to the questions. Just let me segue by coming in with what may answer several questions. And I'll come back and bring this into context, but I'm going to take an excerpt from the book. The second source states that the 600 millisieverts, that's MSV, millisieverts, that's a measurement of radiation, had reached the astronauts during their 1 hour in the Van Allen belt. While passing through the belt, the Apollo astronauts were exposed to an average radiation dose of 0.167 millisieverts per second. This amounts to 600 millisieverts per hour, or 900 millisieverts in 1.5 hours. This is almost one whole sievert, the amount at which detrimental effects on bone marrow, vomiting, nausea, and a general sense of being unwell set in. Mortality here is up to 20%. To these two readings, you have to add the journey through space as such, the time spent on the moon, and the return journey through the Van Allen belts. Now, he includes a whole breakdown of dosages, effective dosages in millisieverts, and the radiation effects. You can read through that. None of these symptoms have been reported to have befallen the Apollo missions. 2 of the 3 Apollo 13 astronauts have by now reached a ripe old age. The third, John Swigert, died of bone cancer at 51. But if this had been a consequence of the radiation belts, the health of his colleagues would also have been impaired. Instead, at the age of 77, this is in 2005, at the age of 77, James Lovell has become the oldest of all the moon travelers, despite the fact that he became more intimately acquainted with radiation belts than any of the others. Not only did he travel to the moon twice, Apollo 8 and Apollo 13, but he also spent one of the return journeys in the thinly protected lunar module. And it goes on to talk about other astronauts that, are still alive. I mean, logic says, okay, if they went through the radiation without protection, how come these guys are all living to ripe old ages? So let's go back to the thickness of the spacecraft, because this goes back to Tamer's question about Apollo 13. So we're going through different millisieverts range and all of that. So he's comparing to Chernobyl, and he said that the whole town was evacuated only because the dose had risen to 6 millisieverts per hour. According to the first source above, 200 millisieverts would have been the maximum that the astronauts would have expected behind a 3-millimeter aluminum skin. This is the estimated thickness of the walls of the lunar module in which Apollo 13 astronauts passed through the radiation belts on their way back from the moon to the Earth. We are told that because of a malfunction of the main spacecraft, the astronauts entered the lunar module and set out on the return journey to Earth, still inside it after attaching to the main spacecraft. They only re-entered the Apollo command module on approaching quite close to the Earth. A thermal and micrometeorite shield of multiple layers of mylar and a single thickness of thin aluminum skin encases the entire ascent stage structure, the cabin of the lunar module. And this is reflective in the press kit for Apollo 11. The walls of Apollo itself were thicker. Okay? But still, we are talking about at the thickest lead shielding they had was 7 millimeters. What was required was 90 centimeters of lead, and it did not exist in any of the spacecraft. Okay, so let's take some questions.
Jonathan was saying, wasn't there a live phone call from the moon to the president?
Yeah, President Nixon.
And how do they claim to get a live phone call through all that radiation and atmosphere without that technology? With that technology?
Yeah, never happened. Never happened. And that brings up a good point. Again, in this book, there are quotes and interviews from researchers that the author quotes from of people who were involved in the Apollo program at the highest levels. And it's in the context of the discussion of compartmentalization, need-to-know basis. And most of the people at the highest levels in the Apollo program, except for a very, very small, a handful number of people that actually knew that they never went to the moon, the balance of the leadership of NASA, engineers, astronauts, etc., program directors, they watched what we as the public did. We watched the television coverage, the feed that was supposedly from the moon. So along with radio and telephone conversations, because that conversation with Nixon was a radio telephone patch that was afforded to them, supposedly from the moon. They did the same thing with the images from the moon, the video camera and the photographs. Same question, how did they get it through the Van Allen radiation belts? Even today, that would be extremely difficult to accomplish. Today, we do it with lasers, okay, because we're bouncing lasers off the moon and we're measuring distances and all of that, but laser communication would be used. It wouldn't be by radio. It wouldn't be by microwave. So, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm not...
You're not doing your job?
Well, there's been a lot of questions. Tamara had said, well, she was talking about the space station, but you may have already...
Space station is at low Earth orbit, and it is between us and the first of the two Van Allen radiation belts. So it's in a low orbit before the first Van Allen radiation belt. Okay? So I'll look through here and see if there's something else. We're going to go to the other topics, but I'm just going to scan through this quickly. You get the gist. We didn't go. There's no way. The explanation of the moon rocks is fantastic. That on the day that we first touched down on the moon, so did the Russians with an unmanned, and they brought back moon rocks. In fact, they did a couple of unmanned missions to the moon and brought moon rocks back. So rocks in exchange for wheat. That's really what it came down to. Just amazing. There's this is kind of silly, but it's called Hotel Lunatic, and this is a plan by a Dutch architect to build a hotel on the moon. The interesting thing about this is the construction of the walls on the moon to protect humans. So let me just give you some numbers. The walls of the hotel are composed of the following. Beginning on the outside, 6-centimeter wall made of moon rock and sand, followed by another layer of 6-centimeter wall made of moon rock and sand, followed by another layer of 3 centimeters of glass, and then 35 centimeters of water, and then another 3 centimeters of glass for a total thickness of the wall of 53 centimeters. So according to this, the hotel guests need 53 centimeters of thick walls to protect them against radiation. This is still a long way off from the 10 meters of water or 90 centimeters of lead that would mimic the Earth's natural defenses against radiation. Okay? So, thank God we have our shields. Just amazing, amazing. Okay, so it goes into all of the rocks and all that, but I think that suffices for today. I think we've debunked the moon landing, the 50-year anniversary. Just amazing. But, you know, again, NASA's own photographs clearly show that this is a studio. I said in my last presentation on the topic, and I'll wrap it up with this, why aren't we seeing stars? There's no atmosphere. Why is it a black sky? It's not because the sun is blocking out the visibility of the stars. The sun wouldn't do that. All you'd have to do is stand in the shadow of the spacecraft, the attenuated side of the spacecraft, in the shadow, and you could look up and see the stars. The sun wouldn't block it out. Okay? And again, as I cited before, the reason they didn't even try to fake stars, any of the constellations, is they knew that even amateur, good, highly skilled amateur observers with their own Earth-based telescopes and their star charts would be able to pick out any errors in their faking of the positions of the stars relative to the positions of the astronauts observing that portion of the heavens from the surface of the moon at any given time and position and orientation. They'd be able to figure it out, that it was a fake background of stars. So what was their solution? It was simple. They'd use a black backdrop. Same thing they did in the hangar for the training. Okay? So what was the reason overall to bring this in for a landing? It was a public relations campaign. It was to boost the morale of the American public, probably the world at large, and it was to reinstate trust in government, in our political leadership. Remember, we went from Kennedy and Johnson to Nixon, and Nixon was the one that got the phone call, as you said. Tricky Dick, that's what he was called. Tricky Dick. I'm not a crook. Okay. So, trying to make our government look like the good guys, trying to make our way of life look like the good guys, trying to make democracy look like the good guys, patriotism in the face of the Vietnam War and how that went to hell in a handbasket. It was a psychological operation, plain and simple, very expensive. And the question, again, he answers in the book is, well, how could thousands of people involved in the space program, how could they keep their mouth shut? Why didn't somebody leak it? Well, the people that are involved are compartmentalized. And he goes into some elaborate detail describing security systems. The basic premise is you don't talk to someone else unless you've been introduced. And you are introduced to this person you're going to talk to, and the person making the introduction clears that person for you. Says, this person has a need-to-know basis. This person knows about XYZ program, so it's okay for the two of you to talk. Otherwise, you don't talk to anybody in terms of using things like secret program or moon landing or Apollo or any of the other words that you're prohibited in your briefing from expressing to anybody, including your family. So the ability to communicate is already structured, on top of the fact that the knowledge you have is compartmentalized. And people don't have a need to know. If you're refueling the Saturn V rocket, you don't know whether it's going to the moon or whether it's going around the Earth or splashing down. And this is an interesting point. Many of the supposed Apollo, Saturn V rocket launches didn't have astronauts on board. In fact, the author makes the point that none of the Apollo missions were manned. Now, I don't know that for a fact. I'm quoting the author. So where did the rockets go? They splashed down in the South Pacific. And there have been a few military pilots that have come out in the latter years saying that they observed the re-entry of Saturn V rockets. Not just the booster, but everything, including the capsule, re-entering into the South Pacific. Food for thought. Okay? Alrighty. Let's move on. This is another book that I recommend for you, and this is by David McGowan. And many of you may know David McGowan. Unfortunately, he's now deceased. Very aggressive sudden onset of a strange form of cancer took him down. David McGowan, several of his books, but this one I'm recommending to you, is called Weird Scenes from the Canyon. Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Heart of the Hippie Dream. The Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. You can find that on the Beast System at Amazon. I'll read a bit of the synopsis. Laurel Canyon in the 60s and early 70s was a magical place where a dizzying array of musical artists congregated to create much of the music that provided the soundtrack to those turbulent times. Members of bands like the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas, the Turtles, the Eagles, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Steppenwolf, Captain Beefheart, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Three Dog Night, Alice Cooper, The Doors, and Love with Arthur Lee, along with such singer-songwriters as Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, James Taylor, Carole King, Jackson Browne, Judy Sill, and David Blue lived together and jammed together in the bucolic community nestled in the Hollywood Hills. He's referring to Laurel Canyon. Now, the Air Force right up above Laurel Canyon was running Lookout Mountain, the Air Force. Laurel Canyon, they had a movie studio set up where they produced over 6,000 movies, more than Hollywood. These were all propaganda films. Okay, I'm going to continue with reading the second half of this synopsis. But there was a dark side to that scene as well. Many didn't make it out alive, and many of those deaths remain shrouded in mystery to this day. Far more integrated into the scene than most would care to admit was a guy by the name of Charles Manson, along with his murderous entourage. Also floating about the periphery were various political operatives, up-and-coming politicians. Jerry Brown, former Governor Moonbeam, California. Jerry Brown is one of those up-and-coming politicians who was right there in the middle of all this, okay, living in the commune. And intelligence personnel, the same sort of people who just happened to give birth to many of the rock stars populating the canyon. And all of the canyon's colorful characters, rock stars, hippies, murderers, and politicos happily coexisted alongside a covert military installation. That's Lookout Mountain that I just mentioned, run by the Air Force. This is all about MK Ultra. Frank Zappa, I'll just quote, just paraphrasing from the book. Frank Zappa stated that he, along with a lot of the other of his contemporary artists, migrated from the East Coast, mostly from Virginia, Alexandria, and Washington, D.C., to the West Coast. Now, there was no hippie movement, there was no pop culture at the time, and he described their migration, he described himself and the others as lemmings. Lemmings are mindless little rodents. He self-described himself and his cohorts as lemmings. They had no explanation as to why they were drawn to Laurel Canyon. As you go back through the book, nearly every one of these well-known artists were the offspring of military officers, Marine Corps, Navy, and Air Force, that were active duty, traveled around the world, And then when these kids came of age, they were old enough to leave home, or nearly, many of them were underage, runaways. They ended up in Laurel Canyon, and they ended up in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. But interestingly, McGowan points out that many of the fathers of these artists were part of the intelligence community during and after their military careers, and that they were directly involved in MK Ultra and a program called Bluebird. Bluebird predated MK Ultra. So what I'm offering to you by way of a connection, because we only have a few minutes left, the connection between Laurel Canyon, Vietnam, and the Moon program. You have three cultural disturbances going on here. As many of you know, in Vietnam, the CIA sent in what were called at the time, and I remember reading this in the newspapers and hearing it on the nightly news, that we had military advisors, about 3,000 military advisors before any uniformed U.S. military personnel landed in Vietnam. Those military advisors and instructors, as they were called, for the most part were CIA operatives and Special Forces troops. Okay? Vietnam was a CIA operation. Laurel Canyon was a CIA operation. Rock and roll, the whole pop culture rock and roll scene was CIA. The hippie movement itself, Haight-Ashbury, LSD, all CIA. McGowan provides the details, provides the evidence. I'm just summarizing. So if we're at 30,000 feet, as we often are, looking at the big picture, or we're flying on patch air, the big picture is you have psychological manipulation taking place of the American public. If you trace LSD and the whole advent of the hippie movement, CIA had 4 safe houses in San Francisco for the distribution of LSD. And Dr. Timothy Leary, who went on the UC Berkeley campus and was promoting LSD before it was outlawed. It was legal at that time. Leary was a CIA operative pushing LSD. And you trace LSD, you trace the hippie movement to Stanford Research Institute, SRI. You trace SRI back to Tavistock in Britain. And Tavistock is a Jesuit organization. And behind the Jesuits are the Kabbalists. That's why I started with the Kabbalah when we introduced the live stream this evening. We go Kabbalists to the Jesuits, to Tavistock, to Stanford Research Institute, to the the CIA. And they're setting up the hippie movement. They're setting up Vietnam, and they're setting up rock and roll and pop culture in the 60s. And you have, from Laurel Canyon, you have the Monterey Pop Festival, and then you have Woodstock. And you have Altamont, which is just above Livermore, where the Livermore National Laboratory is located, is where Altamont Raceway used to be up in the Altamont Pass, and that's where they had that rock concert. These are all CIA operations. So why? Why Laurel Canyon and all of that? Why LSD and the hippie movement? Why Vietnam? And now the Apollo program, supposedly going to the moon. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is just simply looking at factual events. And plenty of evidence exists that these are all CIA, MK Ultra driven programs. I'm not the first to say this. But this is our segue into Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda, which I'm going to share with you tomorrow. This is, in a nutshell, here's the finer point to all of this. It is the destruction of a culture. You do that inside by changing the society. This comes out of Bernays, and I'm going to give you a couple of samples. Okay, this is the book Propaganda, and I'm going to get into the details tomorrow. I'm just going to try to wrap this up. But Edward Bernays makes a couple of statements here I want to read to you. Bernays explained in his 1947 essay, The Engineering of Consent. Now think about, I always use the pejorative of, Joe Bag of Donuts. The person who's just oblivious to what's really going on around him. And it's just, a pawn. He just moves with whatever influence comes at him. The Engineering of Consent by Bernays. This phrase quite simply means the use of an engineering approach, that is, action based only on thorough knowledge of the situation and on the application of scientific principles and tried practices to the task of getting people to support ideas and programs. He argues that predictable elements could be manipulated for mass effects. Again, think about Laurel Canyon. Think about the offspring of officers working in the intelligence communities. Children, MK Ultra, Bluebird, that are manipulated, okay? Predictable elements could be manipulated for mass effects. Look at the effects of the music on now several generations since the 60s. Quoting, but instead of a mind, universal literacy has given the common man a rubber stamp inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, with published scientific data, with the trivialities of tabloids and the profundities of history, but quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamp is the twin of millions of others, so that when these millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. The amazing readiness with which large masses accept this process is probably accounted for by the fact that no attempt is made to convince them that black is white. Instead, their preconceived hazy ideas that a certain gray is almost black or almost white are brought into sharper focus. Their prejudices, notions, and convictions are used as a starting point, with the result that they are drawn by a thread into passionate adherence to a given mental picture. Not only psychology, but sociology played an important role for the Public Relations Council. The individual is a cell organized into the social unit. Touch a nerve at a sensitive spot and you get an automatic response from certain specific members of the organism. Okay? So we'll get into this in more detail tomorrow. I just wanted to give you a taste of where we're going. But it kind of wraps up this whole picture that I've painted for you of the 60s and 70s. We have a direct, purposeful, and scientific manipulation of Joe Bag of Donuts, who's easily manipulated. Because as I have professed for years now with you, critical thinking active critical thinking, thinking skills, thinking analytically, thinking logically, but thinking creatively, going to that 30,000-foot big picture perspective and observing and recognizing that there's a game and that we're being gamed. And when we realize we're being gamed, then we're able to beat the game. We're able to rise above it, think for ourselves, think independently as much as we possibly can. Now, I talked about decoherence in Kabbalah and quantum Darwinism, decoherence in terms of interacting with the environment. And so I'm going to borrow from that in my final comments here by saying our proneness to error, our decoherence, can be minimalized, can be reduced, even though we have to deal with the beast system, we have to deal with computers. We can minimize the stimuli from the system. The example I've often used is turn off the football game. Sports, politics is bread and circus. It's a distraction. It's to overwhelm your senses, sensory overload. When we experience sensory overload, meaning that our prefrontal cortex, which is where critical thinking takes place, when we're overwhelmed in our ability to think clearly, to think critically, our mind naturally regresses. It shifts down to the lemming stage. Isn't that interesting? Frank Zappa. The lemming stage, the brain stem, the first brain as it's called. This is where I've talked about the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight mechanism. There's no critical thinking skill that takes place at the brainstem. This is where lemmings operate, and this is where MK Ultra, with its torture, both physical and psychological torture, targets the limbic system, targets the lemming brainstem level thinking, because it's instinctual and it happens without thought. Okay? So the sensory overload coming from our environment, Bernays talks about commercials. Okay? The input of society into individual minds causes decoherence, causes error in thinking. If we turn these stimuli off, we regain coherence. Think about it like the shields around the earth. When our shields are down, or when our shields are weakened and we've got too much stimuli, too many gamma rays and X-rays coming in from the cosmos, it affects the earth, it affects humans. Same thing if you're watching sports all the time, or you always have music playing, or the television's on in the background as you go about your day. Okay? People driving down the road, it drives me crazy. And you can hear through the closed windows their music. Well, that's a way for them to be immersed in their own little world. It doesn't make them very attentive drivers. But this is what I'm talking about. We can control our sensory inputs. We can reduce the stimuli. The result is you quiet the mind. You free up your mind for the ability to think rationally rather than emotionally, to think logically, to think step by step through evidence that you're examining, thinking about it critically, and coming to your own independent, thought-driven conclusions. I often say, I present something to you and I say, you can draw your own conclusions from this, because I encourage that. All I'm doing is kind of giving you touch points of things that I find interesting, and hopefully you find interesting, and things that you send to me. And quite frankly, one of our patrons got me started on this rabbit hole with Laurel Canyon. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to combine Laurel Canyon, Vietnam, and the Moon Project because they all happened at the same time. So I hope these are things that are of interest to you. And I thank you for hiring me as your reporter, and thank you for sending me articles and things that you want to hear me present in the live streams, because I work for you as your reporter. And these are the ways that the live streams can be guided from topic to topic. We will continue examining Kabbalah. There's a lot more to examine and present. But along the way, we'll drop in these different types of cultural topics. Certainly scientific news that comes out that's germane to what we've been talking about, because we're doing a building block process, both here and with Entangled magazine. We start with foundational information and we build upon it and build upon it. And we've been doing that with artificial intelligence and information and quantum mechanics. In the August issue, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking more about this brain interface, the mind-machine interface, the brain-machine interface. So let me put the cover up again. And I want to thank Doug Diamond from Diamond Digital Media for putting this month's cover together. He's done virtually all of our covers for 18 months. Fantastic artist, but if you need him for audio, video, engineering work, website construction and maintenance, that's what he does for me. He does all of it. I can't do any of this stuff without Doug's help. So this month, August, brain-machine interfaces. And it's kind of a tip of the hat to Metropolis, the Fritz Lang movie from 1927, Metropolis. I've given you a couple of books that I've recommended, but I also recommend watching, if you haven't, Metropolis. It's a silent film, but you are well informed. And if you haven't watched it before, knowing what you know now, going and watching this film, you are going to see all of the things that are embedded in this 1927 silent film. That's absolutely relevant to your everyday walk of life today. Because here's where I'm going to bring us in for the landing and conclude this. Why all of this? Why CIA? Why do you have Vietnam and then you have the anti-war movement, which was born out of Laurel Canyon with the pop music, anti-war music, and the hippie movement that CIA put together through Stanford Research Institute in San Francisco in Haight-Ashbury? Why those encounter to the Vietnam War? CIA promoted, fabricated the Vietnam War, and at the same time, the antithesis of that, which is the peace movement, the hippie movement, the peace symbol, all of that stuff, okay? And the drugs. Why? Well, I'll elaborate more on that tomorrow because it fits back into the Edward Bernays discussion about manipulating the society. You've heard me say for many years now that what they're trying to do is develop a serf class, S-E-R-F, in a feudalistic system with the elite. Think of the king and queen, a monarchy, and the serfs in the feudal system. That is exactly what the entire agenda of the CIA and the greater military-industrial complex is there to serve the masters. They serve the masters. Okay? As the masters provide the funding, military, industrial, and in the scientific communities, the technology's being built out. The masters at a level are the financiers, those that control the finances of the world. But who's pulling their strings? It is the Kabbalists. Those in the inner circle of the Talmudic Kabbalists organization of the one world religion pull all the puppet strings at all of these levels and all the organizations we've talked about before. But what's the purpose of all of these multi-level organizations and the pulling of all these strings? The purpose is to enslave mankind as a serf class. That's in the movie by Fritz Lang, Metropolis, 1927. At the time when quantum physics, quantum particle physics was really coming into its fold, coming into its own, we had Tesla and Einstein and Niels Bohr and Oppenheimer and all these guys coming along. Okay? This is the founding generation of what we're dealing with now, that we're infiltrated, indoctrinated, and manipulated by the Kabbalists. Reflected in the books that I've been sharing, Kathleen and I have been sharing with you about the Kabbalah. That from the late 1700s through into the 1800s, they were accelerating technology for the purpose, we've got enslavement of man as a serf class, and ultimately the destruction of the human race as created by God in His image. The destruction of the human race. Because ultimately, at the finest point of the needle, this is Satan. Because Satan hates God and hates His creation. And he's building out technology at a furious pace, not only for the Kabbalist agenda, the hastening of the return of their Mashiach, the Antichrist, not only for that, but the return of their Messiah, the return of the Mashiach, the return of the Antichrist spirit into this world, from Satan's perspective, is the destruction of everything that God has created, be that planet Earth and the human race within it and all life forms. And again, this is reflective in the redemption of Tikkun. Tikkun is reshaping everything, because everything is considered to be broken from the viewpoint of the Talmudic Kabbalist and needs to be redeemed, needs to be transformed. And if you need a Hindu example, look at the statue of Shiva at CERN. The god of destruction and rebirth. But in between is the laying waste of everything and then the rebirth. So the Hindu is a subset of the one world religion of Kabbalah. Okay? So I hope you're gaining a very clear picture as a critical thinker of what's transpiring. And I encourage you to continue to send to myself and to Kathleen any items that you feel that are of interest to you, that you want us to be aware of, and you want us to explore more. But right now, this is kind of where my mind is set at, is in this psychological manipulation, that we be aware from 30,000 feet of the playing field, of the game, and that we are very well versed in the game. And once we're well versed in understanding their ways of doing things, which at the heart is Kabbalah, then we're better equipped to beat them at their game. And what I mean by that is our souls are protected through the blood of Jesus Christ. That's not a question. But it's the rest of humanity that likewise needs to be saved through Jesus Christ. That's the purpose of laying out all of this evidence of evil. So that you see what's going on and you can, in your own words, in your own way, share evidence of evil with other people. Because we are always being assaulted by these Edward Bernays types of programs. And this is why I'm so cautionary about YouTube and other venues out there, including social media. There's so much disinformation that is put out there by the intelligence communities that it becomes very difficult to discern and to sift through and I don't look at YouTube pretty much unless someone sends me something they want me to look at and evaluate. There are certain things like Dutch Sense for earthquake tracking that I pay attention to. I pay attention to some of the things like Maverick Star puts out regarding pole shift. And we'll do an intensive live stream on pole shift very soon, because we need to. But understand that even in the alternative media arena that we bob and weave through, there's a lot of disinformation out there. And I do my best to try to vet the sources that I bring to you. That's why even with Deanne Loper's book, Kabbalah Secrets That Christians Need to Know, I didn't recommend it to you until I had vetted this. Now it's critical reading. Okay? So, I wanted to wrap this up because I want to try to keep it as close to 2 hours for your sake as I can. Let me look in the chat room real quick. I'll leave chat on for 30 minutes as we've been doing for you to use and share as you like. 1927 film, George, was Metropolis by Fritz Lang. Okay? You guys answered it already. There it is. Yes, definitely. Watch the full version. 2 hours and 27 minutes. Yeah. I see you guys are seeing the same things I am. The question is, how did they know in 1927 what would take place? Yeah, excellent question. Well, I don't know that Fritz Lang necessarily was a Kabbalist, but I would certainly expect that he had knowledge of the agenda of the Kabbalists. He probably was familiar with the Zohar, familiar with the Torah, and familiar with the Talmud. The way that our country in particular has been targeted and manipulated, called a Judeo-Christian, when in fact it was a Christian Judeo. See, the purpose of the Christian Judeo label was Christians reaching out for the conversion of Jews to Christianity, for the salvation through the gospel of Jesus Christ. But it's the other way around now. It is the Jewish conversion of Christians, hence the outgrowth from the early turn of the century of the evangelical movement. That is a Kabbalist fabrication, the evangelical churches. And we've discussed that at length already. But I think Fritz Lang understanding, like many scientific or science fiction writers are scientists for the most part. They are students of science. And as I've done in my 2 novels, looking at the early leading edge, tip of the spear science, and then extrapolating its application into the future is what I did in my 2 books. And many of those things, as I've shared with you over and over again, have unfolded into reality. Well, same was happening in the time of Fritz Lang, the early 1900s. Science fiction writers were looking at scientific advancements that were coming out of the Kabbalist infiltration, indoctrination, and manipulation of scientists to view the reality according to the Kabbalist view, and then explaining it in Kabbalistic terms that were then translated into scientific jargon, much of the scientific jargon itself being invented, developed, so as to mask the verbiage found in Kabbalah. They didn't want to give it away. But I would say that Fritz Lang fully understood the agenda of the technology and then saw the implications of technology to the stratification of society into 2 classes. I call it a bifurcation, a dividing into 2, but it's vertical bifurcation of an elite upper class and an enslaved serf class, serving it and serving the machine. Now, the machine that is in the movie Metropolis is Moloch. So it's also taking from the Bible, okay, and taking from the dark arts reflected in the Bible, warned about in the Bible. So Fritz was a student of the Bible, and I think was fully aware of the dark arts as well, and saw the implications of what technology was doing to enslave man. And we are now enslaved by technology. We are fully immersed in the beast system. We can't get out of it. So it's the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is our salvation from the beast system, to counter the technology. Okay. Let me see what else we have in chat. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. You guys stay in chat for 30 minutes if you want. I'll just leave it running. And again, for those of you this Friday on Blog Talk Radio that are listening to this, please, we ask you to join us as a group of friends. We've been together for 18 plus months now. We have a good group of people here. I mean, it's very friendly, very safe. We can exchange ideas. We can exchange information. We edify one another, both from our Christian belief system, from our spiritual system, from our prayers, from our sharing of Scripture, but also in our sharing of the evidence that we each come up with in our own practicing of our critical thinking skills. And if you're listening for the first time on Friday, I'm sure you find this to be a very unique group and very unique topics that we cover from the way that we cover them. Topics you've heard of, but not from the slant that we approach it from. Okay? All right, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your friendship and your attentiveness as well. I know we go on pretty long. It's almost 2.5 hours. But we'll be back together, Lord willing, and if the technology holds up to the interference, we'll be back tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, for another couple of hours, and we'll lead off with Edward Bernays and propaganda. Thank you, and God bless.